afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law Podcast, brought to you by Digital Law and produced by Amazon Evaluate. As a bit of background, we at Digital Law are a niche law firm specialising and working solely in technology and cybersecurity law. In each episode, we look at the recent stories in the news related to digital technology from around the world, with a specific emphasis on data protection and cybersecurity. For more information on the stories that we're covering this week, please check the links in our show notes. By way of an introduction, I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice lister at Digital Law UK, and I'm joined by my colleague Peter Wright. And I'll let Peter introduce himself, and then we'll dive into the stories we're going to cover today.
Hi everyone, my name's Peter. I'm a solicitor and the Managing Director at Digital Law, and really looking forward to running through a few of these articles with you this week. You might be surprised to know that for once we're not talking about who's been hacked this week. It's a little bit more broad-based, so I will pass back to Amelia to kick us off.
Thanks, Peter. Just before we kick off with today's stories, here's just a bit of background information on our podcast producer, Anson Evaluate. Anson Evaluate are a consultancy company offering a variety of services, including data protection training, outsourced data protection officer services, and specialising in advising clients over multiple jurisdictions. And so if you want to get in touch with them, please feel free, and their information is in our show notes. Moving on to the stories for today, we are going to be looking at cars, AI in the future, Meta being fined for ad-free by the EU, X breaking EU tech rules, deepfake CEOs, Eaton and phones, and more. So starting with the cars. So this is looking at AI and the future. It's fairly interesting here because we are talking about self-driving cars and cars that are being influenced by the AI sector. Essentially here, motorists face the blame if AI makes them crash. So drivers could be held legally liable for crashes caused by overtaking or lane changing, even if a car's automated system was responsible for the manoeuvre. So under revised regulations due to be approved in September by an arm of the United Nations, vehicles will be authorised to switch lanes without the driver initiating the move or even confirming it. So we're talking here about basically a driver not being in any sort of control of the car. And then if that car makes a mistake, then being legally responsible. Does it really seem balanced or fair?
No. So before everyone panics about what exactly is happening, this appears to be a proposed regulation coming through from the UN. And generally the UN doesn't have particularly massive powers when it comes to sort of direct law and direct regulation of this type. But I think it is seen as a bit of a concern because the idea is if it starts sort of top down with the UN laying out principles like this and a number of potentially large countries saying, yeah, we agree with that, there is then obviously the potential that this does become the law that ends up being followed in different jurisdictions and then could end up meaning that where the UN has sort of led, the rest of the world will follow. So as a result, it's interesting that vehicle lobbying groups have heard of this and have looked at the principles that are being proposed. And amongst them, you've got the European Transport Safety Council and the Fédération Internationale Automobile, the FIA, which together represent 242 different separate national motoring organisations, have basically turned around and said that they are really concerned about this idea of liability for self-driving vehicle accidents to be shifted from manufacturers to then end up being wholly the problem of the driver. And I think there's several aspects to this. One is that to a certain extent, the technology is still, of course, very immature. And we still end up reading a lot of instances where people are sort of testing this technology, and very often it's led to injury or fatality. So when we keep hearing of it making frequent mistakes, the idea then of the driver being totally responsible for that doesn't really, when you're a consumer, sort of fill you with particular confidence. But the principle here is that this regulation would allow for and this is the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, UNECE. These regulations which are being devised would allow car makers to expand a lot of the driver control assistance systems that are currently in place. So anyone who's bought a vehicle in the last few years will be terribly, horribly familiar with the level of automation that is already being embedded into the average vehicle. From the minute that you switch the vehicle on, there are flashing warning signs and things that come up that are like, please be aware not to crash into anyone. Please be aware that you are responsible. All these quite ridiculous sort of cautions that come up on a lot of the screens and systems within a vehicle. As well as then, the minute that you, for example, if you're using a GPS navigation system, the fact that it says, you are still responsible for obeying traffic regulations, even though you're following the directions, you're like, yes, well, that's blindingly obvious, but thank you for that. And the fact you then have that on every single journey doesn't become repetitive and wearing at all. But you then have, as well as that, everything from lane assist systems, which in theory will keep you between the narrow white lines when you're on a motorway or dual carriageway, all the way through to sometimes systems that will monitor what the speed limit is and give you a gentle nudge if you are either close to that limit or indeed going over it. And at the moment, you've got the ability, at least usually if you're the driver, to either switch those systems off or politely ignore them. But the point here is that as the use of these systems and this technology becomes more and more embedded in the driving experience, then you could potentially have these rules that come into place governing how those systems will work, to put it bluntly. And I think in particular on British roads, that are many centuries old and actually not built for vehicles at all, rather were built with horses and carts in mind. The idea then of there being an incident on our tight, narrow, winding roads and the driver being totally responsible for something that the vehicle has actually done becomes a little bit more scary compared to if you're looking at the roads in many other countries, even just in Europe, where they're used to much more clear, wide open, straight boulevards, where these sort of instances are less likely to happen.
Well, that's just it. You mentioned about the car kind of understanding and telling you stuff, but the new Renault cars will basically score owners' performance and deduct marks for bad habits. So this is quite interesting because it's kind of taking a look at analysis at a whole new level, because it makes, like they say, it makes backseat driving look like a model of restraints. So these new cars would rate motorists driving out of 100 at the end of each trip and deduct marks for bad habits such as tailgating, speeding, poor lane keeping, and not paying attention. So the scoring system will be available in every new Renault, and drivers could hand their results to insurers to secure lower premiums. And that's the bit I want to focus on. If you've then got AI combined with this new system of scoring, what if it's the AI that then drastically lowers the score and you've got to hand that to the insurer and it's not even reflective of your driving at all? What does that do then?
Well, indeed, so that could have an impact on your insurance premium, and let's face it, we're all familiar with rising insurance premiums. There's also the fact, of course, that how accurate would the information communicated be? But would it be potentially susceptible to fraud? So you could drive the vehicle like an insane person, and then end up. So you could literally drive with no regard for other road users and get constantly low scores, and then fraudulently get the system to say, oh, no, this has been driven really, really well. How would you be able to ensure that did not or could not happen? As fast as you come up with these systems, someone's always out there trying to crack them, let's face it.
Interestingly here as well, drivers are able to choose to not use the software, but they have to reconfirm this every time they start the car. And it cannot permanently be switched off. And from a data protection perspective, what is then happening with all of this data that's being collected? Where's it stored? Where's it processed? Is it stored and processed securely? I mean, we could go down an entire rabbit hole on that one, but safe to say we'll just leave it out there. Where does this data go and what is done with it? I think that would be interesting to see.
Yes, because due to the sheer volume of data, the difficulty is, could you reasonably be able to say, oh, well, it doesn't actually refer to, say, your vehicle registration number, so it's not necessarily personal data. But at what point does it become personal data if you've got the information of regular journeys, which basically show where your journeys start and end, i.e. where you live, and the times that you appear to be leaving and returning to where you live, not to mention your habits in terms of where you work, where you travel, where you might be dropping family members off for school, etc. So that would very quickly, given how we use our vehicles, it's very difficult to see how that couldn't be reasonably interpreted as personal data pretty rapidly, given, say, the sheer volume of what these systems are likely to record.
No, I definitely think we're going to have to see regulators take a very serious look from a data protection standpoint on how systems that are using AI and then collecting vast amounts of data are really going to be used in practice. Because, again, if we're thinking from a data protection standpoint, how easy would it be to hack into a system such as this and to record where people are going? And if you think about, we covered quite a lot in our previous podcast, I think last year, about the Apple AirTags, and that you could essentially put those on people's cars to find out where you were going. If you're then using systems which are tracking your location and where you're going, and you then hack into, say, for example, a celebrity's car, could we then see an increase in stalking, kidnapping, and all of the other nefarious activities that go along with it?
Indeed. I mean, you just look at the fact that someone's just been convicted in the UK of the potential stalking and murder of a high-profile celebrity, and the fact that they were able to seemingly get a lot of information that suggested basically this person ended up thinking they were having a conversation with someone online that was of a similar frame of mind, when actually they were a sort of undercover agent in America who realised that this person was on the verge of causing the celebrity very real serious harm, because they worked out where they lived and what times they were likely to be around, and that means they could have been really at risk. So this sort of stuff happens already, and we're basically giving more tools to the potential to the potential criminal, and more ways of potentially being able to access that information, because no system, unfortunately, is ever foolproof. Now, the driving idea behind this...
Pun intended?
Indeed. The sort of thinking behind this is there's one road safety campaigner who said that, the idea of all these systems on a car, it shouldn't be seen as nannying. Instead, it should be, imagine a world where you don't get a speeding ticket because you are warned if you are going over the speed limit. What freedom, what bliss, says the executive director of the Road Safety Federation.
Interesting.
But the other thing is that they think that, and one of the reasons why this hasn't necessarily received a lot of information, of attention so far, is apparently drivers can end up competing to actually get really bad scores.
Oh.
So at the moment where you can drive along the road and it will say, how's my speed? And sometimes you can go through there, and apparently sometimes drivers don't want to get the smiley face because you're doing below 30 miles an hour. They'll want it to actually flash at you and say, you're actually doing, how high does this go? Can I get the thing that says I should be doing 30 to say 50 and give me a sad face? Apparently some drivers do that. So if you're then going to give them a score for their journey, will you get drivers competing to get the lowest possible score? There is sometimes that aspect of, people that do like to do that. So if you're going to publish that data or freely share it, does that then become a disincentive to good driving standards? What in a lab might seem a good idea to scientists putting this stuff together sometimes does not survive the reality of coming into contact with human beings.
Well, on that cheery note, we'll move on to our next story. So EU says Instagram's paid ad-free breaches rules. So the European Commission says Facebook owner Meta's pay or consent advertising model is in breach of its laws. Under the tech giant's new service in the EU, users must either consent to receiving personalised ads or pay £11 a month to remove them. The Commission has told Meta it takes the preliminary view that the binary advertising choice presented to user fails to comply with the Digital Markets Act, DMA. But Meta contends that its EU advertising model is compliant. So Peter, I'll pass over to you to unpack this one.
Thank you. It's funny, just as I was looking at this and looking at the exact story you were just quoting from there, Amelia, it's got those wonderful words. Meta contends its EU advertising model is compliant.
Righto.
I am reminded of conversations we have with our clients when they're looking at third-party suppliers and they're saying, but this platform, they say they're entirely compliant. Yes.
You take that with a whole spoonful of salt.
Exactly, but then you actually look at the criteria and you look at what that platform's doing and you think, but that doesn't comply. So just because someone puts a stamp on one side and says, well, yes, we definitely comply with this. Well, actually, when you actually lift the bonnet, very often it doesn't. And in this instance, you've got Meta as a digital platform with, in theory, resources behind their compliance, far bigger than virtually any other platform out there. They're saying, oh, well, we're convinced we're compliant. And the EU, who, let's face it, design the rules, are pretty much convinced that they're not.
I think as well, it's important to think about here the fact that Meta are pretty much always covered in our podcast, and it's not for the fun and furry stuff. No. It's because they've received a fine.
Indeed.
Or they've been hacked.
Yes.
Neither of which are positive outcomes. So I don't think it's surprising that we're covering Meta today. And equally, I don't think it's surprising that they're being, that the EU commissioners taking a look at this. I know for a fact if I was told to consent to personalised ads or pay, I think I'd probably just stop using it.
Well,
I know that's pretty.
Yeah, I don't blame you. I've long ago taken Meta's apps off my mobile devices because they're just a form of mass data surveillance. But moving on from that, the point is that the act here we're looking at in Europe is the Digital Markets Act, which incorporates also the Digital Services Act. Remember those initials? We'll be coming back to those with another story. But the Digital Markets Act allows the EU potentially to fine what it calls gatekeepers, i.e. platforms that then facilitate access to users online to then use various different products or services. They can potentially be fined up to 10% of their global revenue. So, of course, Meta, being one of the largest corporations in the world with a turnover that actually is bigger than the gross domestic product of many countries, 10% of its global revenue as a fine is a fairly significant amount. So this is the reason why they are actually sitting up and taking notice here. This isn't unexpected. It's interesting that a lot of American legislators are actually there of the view that the Digital Markets Act is solely there for the EU to turn around and fine US corporations. And when you see a decision like this, not really surprising either. So the point here is that this is a fairly new tool that the European Commission has, the Digital Markets Act. And they're using the big stick to then turn around and potentially go after the biggest corporation that would be consistently, in their view, flouting their regulation. So the idea is that this pay or consent model, which was adopted in 2023, could be in breach of the principles of that Digital Markets Act. Interestingly, we love talking about data on this podcast, and we always do a lot of advice on that in our firm. And the European Data Protection Board separately gave an opinion in April that said platforms charging a fee for accessing an equivalent version of their services without personalized ads should give significant consideration to offering an additional alternative. In this instance, Meta is just saying it will lower its subscription fee from $9.99 to $5.99 to try and ease regulators' concerns. But they're saying, well, it's still not a real choice, is it? No. It's just a binary, pay if you want to be ad-free or not. And
it's not even ad-free because you can still have ads that are not personalised.
Yes.
And that's kind of the main thing. If, I think we all know we're going to get ads, whatever service you use these days. You either pay to not have ads or you have to suck it up.
Get advertised to within an inch of your life.
Yeah, exactly. But the whole point is, there should be a kind of pop-up banner that says, do you want personalised ads? In which case you say, no, thank you very much. I'll stick with the random ads you throw at me. And this is what we're not getting here. You either have personalised ads or you have to pay for ad-free. There's no kind of happy little middle line.
No, exactly.
And that's the problem.
That is indeed the problem. And it's also the fact that now they're saying this is what we're looking to do. They say that this investigation should conclude within 12 months. So they're saying this is the initial finding. It will now be down to Meta to try and dispute that.
I think they're going to have a tough time doing that.
Yeah, well, if they're saying, oh, yes, we're compliant, well, now that's it. They've got to demonstrate how is it compliant. But from the public statements made by the commissioners, it suggests, well, it really isn't. Margarita Vestager, the EU Commission's Executive Vice President and Competition Policy Chief, is the person who's been around, who oversaw the introduction of this law, shepherded it through the European Parliament, and has been one of the people behind the development of the legislation. So I think she knows how it works. And wouldn't have come out and said this if she didn't understand what it was going to do. So that there might be an awful lot of wailing and screaming and gnashing of teeth from Meta on this, but this is unfortunate what the legislation is designed to do. It also crushes any hope for digital innovation by any businesses within the EU. So everyone always asks, well, where is the European Meta or Google? Well, you're never going to get it with a level of digital technology regulation like this. But the whole point is it's also designed to keep out the or heavily regulate the US tech providers. So if
Sounds
you're
about right.
if you're inside the EU's legislative wall, as all EU consumers are, this is what you have to comply with if you're going to try and sell to that 250,000 consumers.
And speaking of regulation, our next story kind of closely relates to that. So the EU says X's blue tick accounts deceive users. So Elon Musk's social media site X, formerly known as Twitter, has been accused by the European Union of breaching its online content rules with its verified blue tick accounts having the potential to deceive users. So essentially here, before, you would be verified if you're a celebrity or you're a public figure. You get the gist. You'd look and see, oh, that person's verified, they're clearly who they say they are. However, you can now pay for the blue tick. So, I could go away today and think, you know what? I want to, one, download Twitter because I'm not even on it to begin with, but two, verify myself just for fun. And am I inclined? No, but might others be? Yes. And it's quite interesting where you can then take that, because you are deceived, because you think, okay, if someone messages you saying, well, I'm Blake Lively, and they've got the blue tick, they're probably going to think they're Blake Lively. I mean, I'm sure many people would jump for joy if that was the case.
Yeah.
But the point here is you could quite easily use this for nefarious purposes.
Yes.
Peter, I'm sure you can go into more detail here.
And the point is that you don't actually have to pay an awful lot for that blue tick. I mean, for some people, they will never conceive of paying anything for these services. But X have specifically put this. So I think it's the equivalent to the cost of a frothy coffee or something. It's the equivalent of paying that for your X blue tick per week. So I think it's like $7 or $8 a month or something like that.
Yeah, that rings a bell to me.
So that's sort of what they sort of set it at. And of course, this is one of the things they introduced because the advertising revenue fell off a cliff not long after Elon Musk completed the $44 billion takeover of X.
This is where we've got the beautiful DMA and DSA
yes.
coming back in.
So the Digital Markets Act looks at the behaviour of those gatekeepers in particular, and looks at things from the behaviour of those large platforms and how they are interacting with the rest of the market and how they're providing their services. So hence our last story when we're looking at Meta is looking at those sort of broad brush competition issues. The Digital Services Act is more about content and how individuals receive that content and how they interact online. And hence that's the point here on the sort of potential deceiving of users. And as you quite rightly say, what if you end up seeing a profile on X and think that is definitely that person because they've got the blue tick, when that used to be the case that the blue tick was handed out. So if, for example, you had Barack Obama, Donald Trump on X, previously Twitter, you would see the blue tick and think, oh, that is the genuine account rather than a fake account.
Yeah.
That level of sort of verification is no longer there. Now anyone can be verified if you have the blue tick. And let's face it, there aren't the number of actual human beings working at X that there used to be. An awful lot of them were fired shortly after the takeover. So it's not as though people are sat there verifying, is this person who they say they are? It's more, would you like a blue tick? Please confirm your payment details. Thank you very much. You have a blue tick. So there is the potential for abuse of that system, which probably wasn't fully thought through at the time as it was introduced.
And then you've got the misinformation limit of this as well, because, okay, for example, you've mentioned Donald Trump there. We are in the presidential year, and for example, if you pretend to be Donald Trump on X and start circulating misinformation around the election, you could potentially do that, because guess what? You've got a blue tick, so people will be thinking, oh, great, this is Trump's policy, this is what he's going to say he's going to do, when in actual fact, it's not Trump, it's some person sat at home having a great laugh, as opposed to something that's completely made up.
Yeah. So the point here is there's just a general lack of transparency, and they're just feeling that does not fit within the principles of the EU's rules around digital services. Speech marks. Since anyone can subscribe to obtain such a verified status, it negatively affects users' ability to make free and informed decisions about the authenticity of the account and the content they interact with. There is evidence of motivated malicious actors abusing the verified account to deceive others. More specifically, Thierry Breton, who again, he's the commissioner who's been behind the DSA and very much sort of shepherding that, the legislative development of the Act through the European Parliament. He said, back in the day, blue checks were used to mean trustworthy sources of information. Now with X, the preliminary view is that they deceive users and potentially infringe the DSA. What happens now? X has the right to defend itself. It can say why it thinks the EU is misconceived in having received this view. But they've said, after the EU confirms its view, they will then impose fines and could require significant changes to be carried out to the platform. And the point is that if those changes aren't then carried out, they could probably fine or increase the levy in terms of fines for ongoing persistent breaches where those issues are not corrected. So it's not as though Musk can go, okay, fine, well, we'll pay a fine of so many $1 million and then we'll carry on doing it. There's nothing you can do because you've already fined us. There could be ongoing enforcement against X as well to try and force them to comply when it comes to how they handle the data of EU citizens. And of course, the concern here is no matter how valuable that EU market is, there are bigger and potentially wealthier markets increasingly elsewhere. So Musk may, in a fit of pique, go, well, fine, we'll just stop operating in Europe then. That is always the concern on this. Very often you get the big tech companies have always sort of saber-rattled this and said, oh, well, we won't bother supplying services in the EU market. Well, if they are then increasingly clobbered with big fines, the saber rattling, apart from rather than cry wolf, it might actually become the reality. That will be the concern here. So that will be the, it's all well and good to talk about the rights and freedoms of data subjects, but will their rights be affected if then they aren't able to enjoy the benefits of going on X or Meta, as we were talking about under the Digital Markets Act earlier? Yeah. How will your rights and freedoms be affected if you can't actually get onto those platforms anymore because they've been blocked in Europe?
Exactly. I'm sure we will have more on both of these two stories in the next coming weeks, and I don't think it'll be a worthwhile moment for the investigations to go on. Moving on to our next story, we've got deepfake fraudsters impersonates FTSE chief executives. So the AI-generated voice notes are used to trick people into transferring money. So this is very interesting because you've got fraudsters that are impersonating CEOs, but you've also got the fact that the CEOs aren't then reporting them. So you've kind of got a double-edged sword there of people don't know it's happening and also then don't know how to
it's helped as well by the fact that to a certain extent some law enforcement agencies don't see issues here of impersonation as a scam. So they're saying, oh no, we're just interested on they'll say, oh, we're responsible for recording fraud cases, but we don't monitor impersonation. And you're like, but
right.
Yeah, they're impersonating in order to scam people. So sometimes you get law enforcement agencies with a slightly too rigid definition of what they should or should not be covering. But the point here is that this technology is becoming so very freely available and easy to use that more and more scammers can potentially then use AI tech to then impersonate someone's voice and make it sound like that genuine individual is leaving voice notes, more often than not as part of sophisticated WhatsApp scams, to try and make people think that there is a genuine legitimate transaction taking place and that a senior member of management at executive level is actually saying, you must transfer this money, you must do this, you must do that. And in some instances, these scams have only actually been revealed when the recipients of the scammers then actually, for example, seen the real person supposedly that's supposed to be at a conference, or they've actually got a spokesman and said, is this you? And they've worked out, no, it isn't. And in some instances, they've said the voices can be very difficult not to tell the truth. Sometimes I think is it actually a recording that's been sewn together of different things the individual has said. Other times then the voice is totally synthetic, but the way that, for example, an English speaker might spot that it is a scam is through the way it says, for example, we will rather than I'll, which is something you might otherwise do. I'll go and do that for you rather than I will.
Yeah.
Might be the way that it's sort of things that an English speaker would spot. That
small
use.
nuances.
but those nuances might be lost on someone for whom English is a second or third language and might think, oh, this is perfectly genuine.
Yeah.
So it means increasingly you've got to be more and more on the ball to actually be able to potentially spot whether these things are indeed fakes.
Doesn't that fill you with a lot of joy and confidence then?
It does, but this is the reason why we end up just not trusting anything we ever receive anywhere ever.
Yeah, I think one of my favourite stories that we have to tell is when our accountant legitimately contacted us because for one reason or another they needed to check payment details, and they're like, oh, this is unexpected. Why has this come through? And we were like, well, can you jump through these hoops? And they're like, well, why are you asking this of us? And we're like, because it looked like a scam. It's like, and as it turned out, it was our actual accountant asking for real details, but nonetheless, we assume scam and then have to prove otherwise, which I think is an okay approach to take. At least, you're not going to fall, well, you shouldn't fall forward for anything, but nonetheless.
Indeed.
Moving on to our final story of today, we are looking at Eton. Eton are banning smartphones for new pupils. The school issued boys with an offline Nokia handset instead amid wider moves to improve children's mental health and behaviour. So the school has written to families of all incoming pupils to inform them of the new policy, which will take effect in September. The college joins other private schools and state schools in tightening rules around smartphones because of concerns about their impacts on mental health and behaviour. So it's fairly interesting here because, we've gone from a point where for someone that was in school, it was always who's got the best phone, who's got the latest iPhone. And now it's kind of going in the opposite direction where you're not allowed to take these smart, snazzy phones into school. Instead, you get a Nokia brick, which is what pretty much I was given when I was a kid.
Exactly. And I think there's increasingly a lot to be said for that. So it's interesting that, that this headline, it's telling you this is what's happening at Eton. But actually the real interesting thing is how many other schools are actually doing something very, very similar. I think for a long time there's been the perception of actually, we don't want to harm kids' digital skills and parents want their kids to be safe, so they'll give them a sort of hand-me-down mobile phone. And then that phone increasingly will be sophisticated enough so that they can have apps on like TikTok, Instagram, WhatsApp. That then can be quite addictive. It can be used for pupils to then contact each other. Sometimes they end up verbally and mentally abusing each other on there.
The cyberbullying issues.
The bullying can continue after 5 o'clock and after you've left the school gate, which is particularly unpleasant. And increasingly, then when you see issues around kids spending too long on TikTok and being zombies at school, and they're increasingly sort of becoming quite a negative thing to potentially have a smartphone for people. So. There are a number of schools here that are turning around and saying, actually, we're only going to let pupils have that sort of Nokia brick dumb phone. The most addictive thing on there will be Snake. And you'll just have to deal with that. And that, certainly when you're on the school grounds, and in some instances you're looking at boarding schools, so they're saying there will be rules around when you can and can't potentially then use a smartphone, and you're only able to use the school dumb phone that we've given you. And I say this isn't just Eton, it's more and more schools are doing it. And interestingly, it's come over to the UK from California. So increasingly, you've got a lot of the schools over there where they are actually teaching the children of a lot of the people who are, have founded and work within these big tech giants. And they're of the view they don't want their kids anywhere near those platforms. And therefore, they are encouraging schools to say, we want them to have either a basic phone or no phone at all.
I think there's something to be said for that. If you've got the people that created these big platforms saying, kids should not have access to them, what does that really say about the fact that they are so widespread and so used by pretty much every child I know? I mean, you've got this generation now that are just called iPad kids because, you just get given an iPad or a phone from day one. And this then appears to be changing.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that this is happening socially. I mean, funny enough, this story we read in the Times, and there's a poll on there that asks readers, should mobile phones be banned in school? And you can then tick and say yes or no. And interestingly, 95% of Times readers who subscribe to the website have said mobile phones should be banned in schools. Though I think there is potentially, though, a bit of a class issue here as well, because you might find that the comparatively well-off families that can say, oh, our kids will have, they'll have more sort of, I think they almost call them sort of genuine sort of activities where they'll take the kids out and they can give them activities and things to do. Whereas a time-poor family, where the parents are, holding down one or more jobs and don't have time to spend hours and hours with the kids, are just going to say, give them a tablet, as you say, give them a phone or an iPad, sit here and watch that. I've now got to go and cook dinner before then helping, driving off somewhere else to do another job or something. You think, well, I say, well, will that sort of form a divide? Will you have lower income groups who are going to be almost parented through using smart technology and smartphones, whereas then you potentially got more well-off ones who haven't? I hope it doesn't lead to that sort of social divide. So if anything, if you do get some more unified rules around this in schools as a whole, will that help? But then is that a greater level of state regulation in our lives? I really struggle with that.
And I think there needs to be a balance as well between, quite like Eton have done, in terms of the difference between a smartphone and a phone, because I agree that smartphones should not be used in schools, but I myself used to walk around 2 miles to my secondary school at the age of 11 on my own, come rain or shine, which again, character building, lovely. But my mum liked to know that I actually made it to school okay. And so I would have to text her at the school gates. Mum, I'm at school. See you later. And equally, when I was leaving, Mum, leaving school. So she knows when I was going to be home. I think there is a fair balance here, because we do live in an age where, it isn't exactly always safe to be out there on your own. So there is that fine balance that I think needs to be found between smartphones and what comes with, internet usage, etc. But also then a Nokia brick that's actually used, because what is a phone for? Making calls and communicating.
Making calls and communicating. So you can still have that sort of element of helicoptering and be able to make sure that your kid's safe. Which very often is why parents want to give their kids the phone. But you can do that without then opening up the further possibilities through them having the smart technology on a smartphone.
I think this is a debate that is going to keep going round and round until, like you say, we do get that fairly unified response. I do think there's going to be a fair amount of lobbying from either side, because, as you and I have just said, there is a lot of differences and kind of factors that need to be considered here when we are thinking about the use of smartphones. But I think we're definitely going to be revisiting this.
We will, because I think it's a lot easier said than done. I mean, there's a lot of schools where I think now homework is set through apps. I know some schools it's sort of, you get your reward points and everything, and house points and everything is done through the smartphone. So, if you've got the Nokia brick and that doesn't allow for installing of that, well, how is that going to work? Because you've got a lot of schools now that I think are almost dependent on being able to have that element of when the kids are doing the homework at home, they're doing it through the mobile device, or certainly relying on using that mobile device to report on what it is they're doing. And it's almost like you've got to sort of then put that genie back in the bottle. And interestingly, just a final thought on this is that the UK Parliament, we've just got a new Parliament in the UK after our general election. So you've got new MPs turning up like kids on their first day at Hogwarts at the Palace of Westminster. And they are allowed to have smartphones and tablets in Parliament.
That surprises me.
It is, and it was a fairly recent invention, but of course then had the silly effect of one MP who had to stand down after actually watching porn during the parliamentary debate.
That's a smart idea, isn't it?
Exactly. Yes, indeed. So we'll leave the jokes around tractor porn and exactly what it was he was searching for. That led to the fact that then it was the MPs behind him who could see what he was watching on his phone. I mean, you've got to ask yourself a lot about the mentality of someone to do that in a public space. But there you go. But regardless of what Neil Parish got up to, we've then got the fact that, and it was interesting that I heard a debate that between two previous Speaker and Deputy Speakers of the House, who were saying actually that would be the one thing they would now ban and reverse, would be MPs being able to use mobile devices. Because they said they get the point of, it's good to be able to get a text and say, to let you know about something and perhaps you've got to urgently leave. That's one thing. But it's another if now apparently you get MPs who turn up and will sit on the benches for hours and sit there just scrolling through and not actually engaging in what the debate actually is, which is the reason why they're there in Westminster.
Which is sort of their job, you know.
Yeah.
If I was sat here scrolling my phone and we were supposed to be having a conversation, I think there were some choice words that have to be said.
There would. And let's face it, that's going back, that's the problem that teachers have got in the classroom, isn't it? Are the kids too busy looking around on their phones rather than actually doing the stuff that they should be doing in school, i.e. learning?
Yeah.
So that's, as I say, if we're going to go down this route, there's an awful, it's not a straightforward 3-point reverse turn that they're going to have to do on this. There's going to be a lot more involved, and what could be a good, pleasing knee-jerk reaction, like 5% of people on a poll say, oh yes, we'd like to ban it. So I'm sure focus grouping this idea is probably really popular.
Yeah.
Your problem's going to be, how is it actually going to work? And that could require an awful lot of thought.
So that was our last discussion of the episode. And I mean, this is one of the few episodes where we've kind of left on a more uplifting note, not all doom and gloom.
So I hope so.
There we go, we made it to the end.
Yes.
And if you do have any questions about what we have talked about today, please feel free to email us at admin@digitallawuk.com. A summary of today's stories are available on our website, as well as the links to the original stories with more information. And if you'd like to hear more from us, including information about subscriber-only podcasts, webinars, and events, then please subscribe to our premium via our Patreon channel using the link in the show notes. A big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this podcast. And if you'd be interested to hear more about Anson Evaluate services, please take a look at their website that you can find at www.ansonevaluate.com. Just a reminder, these episodes are available on our website, YouTube channel, podcast channels such as Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, and please feel free to leave us a review. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again next week.